The polar bear has become the most iconic image of climate change, as climate change has historically been publicized and protested by the environmentalist movement. Threats to wildlife are so emphasized that we forget humans, too, cannot escape the impacts of climate change. Climate change and its human causes are an injustice issue because of endangerment to the safety and livelihood of many human populations. This has created a new category of refugees known as climate refugees. These people have seen their homes so impacted by the changing climate that they are forced to leave and seek safety and security elsewhere. Climate change has been a long approaching and stark reality for our planet that we are only now beginning to take seriously on national and international scales. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change states that Earth's average global temperature will increase 2.5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit over the next century. Shown are the best to worst case scenarios. All of them show an inevitable increase in global temperature. For many, climate change's manifestation will be deeply problematic across the planet. We will see changes in precipitation resulting in floods and droughts, severe hurricanes, and a 1 to 4 foot rise of sea level. The impacts of climate change on the environment are clear, but often the human aspects remain ignored. Climate change affects millions of people in various and unequal ways. Many must leave their homes and cross international borders, but they are yet to be legally recognized as refugees. A refugee is currently defined through the 1951 Refugee Convention as a person who is being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, and must leave their home country to ensure their safety. The current refugee definition indicates that human rights are violated, warranting international protection of affected individuals. In order for the potentially 40 million climate-displaced people to be considered refugees, we must ask, do climate change and its impacts present a human rights issue? Climate justice is the idea that climate change and its impacts are not merely environmental concerns, but human rights concerns as well. Climate justice asks who has access to what in order to cope with climate change, who gets to make decisions regarding climate action, and who contributed to climate change in the first place. Climate justice can be applied to climate refugees because they overwhelmingly come from poor, developing countries. These countries have contributed little to atmospheric carbon, have little sway in political and climate talks, and are most vulnerable to the oncoming effects of climate change. This is due to our world economic system, global politics, and a past history of colonialism, oppression, and marginalization. Through several case studies, we will illustrate how climate refugees have been put in vulnerable positions by global structures and processes. Many climate refugees have come from Tuvalu, an island nation in the South Pacific. Tuvalu suffers from the impacts of climate change in that much of their land is already below sea level. This leads to frequent flooding and risk to agriculture. Tuvaluans have lost their crops and their homes, and many have asked for help. This small island nation is not contributing to climate change to the same extent as many developing nations, but it is being destroyed by climate change. With the case of Tuvalu, we see the devaluing of brown, poor bodies, as well as the traditional wisdom and knowledge that these people have. Island countries have been warning us that changes in the environment are problematic, and we are only now starting to listen. So why have we been ignoring climate change for so long, even though peoples of countries like Tuvalu have warned us of the consequences? Theories such as risk society and Treadmill of Production can help us answer this. Risk society is the idea that, in order to embrace and build modernity, we accept that a degree of environmental and social harm are necessary consequences. As a global society, we have accepted that risk and jumped onto the treadmill of production. The treadmill of production is the idea that the developed world promotes economic growth, profit, and consumerism as a means of achieving modernity and happiness. Unfortunately, the treadmill of production and risk society are a double-edged sword. We cannot produce and consume the way we are indefinitely without facing consequences far more serious than we had anticipated. One of these consequences is global climate change. However, the severity and swiftness of that rebound will be different for peoples across the globe. The most socioeconomically vulnerable peoples who are not benefiting from the treadmill of production will be hit hardest. Tuvalu, for example, suffers disproportionately from climate change and does not have the resources to deal with the mass number of climate refugees, making this issue one of climate justice. Island countries aren't the only places where we can expect to see climate refugees. Bangladesh is a relatively flat coastal country with a large network of rivers and is highly vulnerable to storms and floods. Those environmental threats will only grow worse as climate change progresses. Bangladesh is a developing country, and it is considered extremely vulnerable to climate change because of the high population, position on the coast, and lack of governmental ability to respond to harsh storms. Rural people in Bangladesh have become so accustomed to frequent flooding that they flood-proof their homes, their crops, and their communities. They are losing their land because of sea level rise, which results in heavy flooding. Also, storms sweep ocean water into the mainland, salinating fresh water and destroying agriculture. As a result, many are fleeing toward inland cities. However, Bangladesh's cities will eventually be unable to support the enormous number of refugees fleeing the coast. Already its slums are packed with environmentally displaced peoples, and when sea level rise and flooding gets worse, the cities may become as vulnerable as the coastal villages. A generally poor and subsistence-based country, Bangladesh has not benefited from the processes that created climate change, but is bearing some of the most severe burdens of climate change so far. While island and coastal countries fear the effects of sea level rise and ocean storms, there are non-coastal countries for whom climate change still presents an enormous problem. East Africa is an entire region of highly agricultural nations. Climate change has led to extreme, unpredictable precipitation patterns that damage crops and create famines, endangering lives and the economies of those nations. This has forced many to flee from their homes and become climate refugees in order to survive. Ethiopia and Kenya are particularly at risk, and so many climate refugees come from those countries.
We conclude this drought, then we have a severe rains in most parts of the country. And of course it finds when the ground is very dry, and so we have flooding. And here you are talking about just an African government, a developing country in Africa. It poses a serious challenge. Slavery. They have wiped us out during colonialism. Now they are wiping us out with climate change. Africa's vulnerability cannot be traded for luxury with these countries.
Historical oppression and a devaluing of African lives links back to the colonization of Africa. Many African countries were exploited in exchange for the comfort of the developed world. This illustrates how climate change and its impacts are heavily rooted in global society and history. These three case studies highlight the global connectivity of climate change. National CO2 emissions clearly indicate that developed countries contribute much more to the atmospheric carbon causing climate change than developing countries we have discussed. The developed world, through its consumerism, industry, and push for profit, is largely responsible for the difficulties developing countries are experiencing in the face of climate change. In a weak attempt to address this injustice, the developed world has hosted climate summits and conferences and has made agreements to cut back on emissions. At these meetings, developing nations are often underrepresented. The decisions ultimately made do not ensure justice for climate victims who have already lost their homes or soon will. Without more serious action and inclusivity, we are still likely to see millions of climate refugees in coming decades. In anticipation of this reality, it is important we recognize climate-displaced people as refugees and as human rights victims who must be assisted internationally as a protection of their rights. As an increasingly globalized society, we must welcome each other with open arms as it becomes clearer how small and singular our planet is. We must also understand that human rights issues extend far beyond direct human conflict and can be rooted in the context of the natural environment. The necessity for climate justice for current and future climate refugees is then difficult to dismiss.